Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation Policy section. We apologise for starting a little late, but we've got three presentations. I'm going to kick off because mine was a little bit general, so I'm going to chair the session this afternoon. My name's Peter Sweatman. I'm Director of the Transportation Research Institute here at the University of Michigan, or UMTRI as we're known. And we've got a couple of great speakers to join the panel. We're going to try and save a little time at the end to actually have a panel set. Hello. Okay. I'll just agree with that, I think. Oh. Maybe not. Subscription. Well, let's keep moving while we can. Okay, at least we've got a nice clear picture up there. So I'm going to just kind of introduce this session by trying to lay out a few definitions. You know, generally speaking, we sometimes get asked around the campus here, what is transportation? What is it? So I'm going to try and shed a little light on that subject, particularly in a policy context. So I think, certainly our transportation systems are reasonably common, have very common elements between US and China, and so we have a lot to work on, and I think we can do a lot together. There are certainly a number of challenges to sustaining the current US transportation system. I'll touch on that. What is sustainable transportation? What kind of transformation are we talking about? What sort of scale? What might help bring that about? And then finally, what policy elements might need to come into play? I guess some of the key points, we're talking here about transportation as distinct from automotive. And of course here in southeastern Michigan we almost assume that we're talking about automotive as soon as we talk about transportation. And we are of course to a large extent, but not totally. The current transportation, we do have a system. It's a system problem. It's hard to get that across to a lot of people. It's hard to get people excited about that idea that we have a system that could be improved, but that's what we have. Currently, the system is one that wasn't really designed, and we can't really control it. And maybe I'll mention a couple of examples of system behaviour that have taken place in the last couple of years that we would have loved to have controlled, but we actually didn't. They were influenced by things external to what we normally think of as transportation. We need to transform the system to be sustainable, and certainly new business models and entrepreneurship will play a big role, especially in this country, in the US, along with national policy. National policy will go a certain distance, but we need to have industry and entrepreneurs and business involved in this. So we usually think about transportation systems in terms of vehicles, drivers, infrastructure, and more recently, and very importantly, connectivity between all those elements. And we're talking about moving people and goods. And it's very important to remember that we are also talking about moving goods, and we tend to forget about that. And that's something that we're very interested in here at the University of Michigan. So here's my little diagram. It's a 3x3 matrix, I guess, showing what is it now and what could it be in the future. So on the vertical axis we have the human element, which is some element of demand for proximity to work and so on. Remote access, we may not need to travel to do what we need to do. And finally, mobility, and I guess that's the thing that we've got terribly excited about over the last century, is mobility. But really there are three things there that humans need. And across the top axis there is the physical dimension, or how we supply transportation. The built environment, certainly an important part, information technology, and the transportation systems that we often think about. And here we often think about transportation modes, and we talk about multimodal transportation. So we're talking about cars, taxis, buses, streetcars, etc., etc. So usually, of course, we tend to think very much in the bottom right-hand corner, and a lot of the research and policy has been clustered down there, but we have a lot to do to expand out across this territory. And I guess that's the challenge and maybe the answer for sustainable transportation. Currently, of course, privately owned vehicles dominate transportation investment. We're highly invested in privately owned vehicles. Huge increase in VMT, vehicle miles of travel, by 150%, while the population increased 30%. Don't forget about highway freight, doubled in the 80s and 90s, and it's now 7.5%, or it was in 2000, of VMT. Transportation services is a huge part of the economy, 3% to GDP. The infrastructure, often we tend to neglect. We don't think about it too much, but really it's basically kind of static, and at the same time we have congestion and bottleneck issues, particularly bottlenecks for freight, and all kinds of arguments about how we could fund the system, and we don't really have a lot of data to support that. I just want to point out that the public highway system had, well, the last time I could find this was aggregated a few years ago, had an asset value of about $1.3 billion with an annual spend of about $100 billion. But if we think, and it's generally considered that's a lot of money, and we spend a lot of money on infrastructure, but in fact the private sector vehicle operating costs operating on that system, much bigger investment, and typically over $200 billion being spent on vehicle ownership alone. If we look at where that happens, and Walter McManus, who many of you know, has done this great value map showing on the where the money goes and where the profit is made in the auto industry and related industries, and you can see the operating margin on the vertical axis against the share of industry revenue. So the auto manufacturing, if we look at the area of these boxes, it's kind of interesting to contemplate and look at auto insurance. We had a presentation a little earlier on from the insurance industry, but you know, this is a huge industry. We often just think of the auto industry, but even used cars, et cetera. And of course, because we're so highly invested in cars, we make more trips. Transportation is about 18% of consumer expenditure, so it's a big investment. It's about 9 times what the average household spends on education, about 3 times what it spends on health, and about 1.5 times what it spends on food. There's a very low marginal cost of extra travel. We have smaller and smaller households, so we have more free time, so we can travel more. About less than 30% of trips are actually work-related, and of course we have increasing delays and so on. So what I think we're going to see, and we're seeing already, is the rise of the transportation service economy. Vehicles are going to cost more. Batteries alone maybe are going to be $7,000 for electric vehicles. A lot of technologies right now are not being deployed because they add cost to the vehicle. A lot of safety technologies, certainly in cars, but also, I think more importantly, in heavy trucks, very reputable and useful technologies are not being deployed. We may be looking at pricing of the transportation infrastructure. What about externalities? Should that be included? It's certainly not included at the moment. And in the freight sector, we might see some vertical integration of trucking, warehousing, logistics and so on, which will add more to this kind of service economy in transportation. The integration of vehicles in cities is an important issue. The electric vehicle business model, how exactly is that going to work out? Who's going to aggregate enough electric vehicles to provide the load balancing needed to bring renewable energy into the picture? Vehicle connectivity, and of course, you know, for one who's involved in research, we think about the explosion of transportation data that's going to happen, and who owns that data? I think we own our own data, probably, but who's going to own, make use of that and make useful applications out of that data? So a lot of interesting things happening. many challenges we're aware of, and a lot of the transportation research we do is really trying to address some of these challenges. The demand for mobility tends to keep going up, but with one recent exception, the freight task is developing even faster than VMT for personal use. Multiple issues: congestion, energy, environment, climate, safety, emergencies. We have an aging interstate system. Of course, the interstate system, when it was built, was one of the greatest innovations we've ever seen in transportation, probably along with the shipping container. We think that connected vehicles are going to be the next big innovation in the system. Of course, and I think this has been mentioned many times, but transportation is right up there in terms of generating greenhouse gases, maybe 30% in this country, and when we add transportation and electricity generation, it's close to 70%. So we do see powerful examples of system behaviour. So here's the ever-increasing trend of VMT, and this was some work that Michael Sivak was speaking earlier. He's been tracking this probably better than anybody. And you see VMT going up decade after decade, year after year. And then, of course, a couple of years ago, it started to come down. And that was related to the fuel price, certainly, but it was also related to unemployment. And there were many factors spun off this decrease. One very interesting one from our perspective was that annual fatalities reduced from 43,000 to 34,000. So 9,000 lives were saved every year simply because we had this little downturn in VMT. A lot of system countermeasures, so-called, for greenhouse have been evaluated. It's hard to actually do a systematic study of this because these things are very interactive, but certainly the big ticket items come out as being things that reduce travel, make people think twice about travelling, pricing, regulation, changes in land use, wholesale changes in commuting patterns, and so on and so on. So many areas of countermeasure, but not really in a systematic way. So what do we mean by sustainable transportation, and how might that be affected by policy? Oh, I meant to take that one out. So we don't really have a national transportation policy, and Rob Bettini is probably going to talk about, I'm sure he's going to talk about the reauthorisation bills, which are quite comprehensive because they're 6-year bills. But Skinner back in 1990 put out this report, Moving America, and of course that was the year that Michael Bolton won the Grammy that year. And so maintaining facilities, that was a priority. Having a sound financial base, a strong transportation industry, safety and security, the environment, and promoting US technology. And of course, there wasn't much mention of energy anywhere in there. And I guess another related issue there is we don't really have a national energy policy, but certainly these worlds are going to come together when we introduce electric vehicles in a big way. So some interesting enduring things there. Things haven't changed that much in some ways. So sustainable transportation, it's 2 words. And unlike sustainable other things, it's not that truly we need to think about both words, I think. And most of the research and the policy and so on has been kind of weighing on that sustainable word. It's been trying to develop, I think the word interventions was used in the previous presentation, or in safety we talk about countermeasures. So lots of things. So safety is obviously important there. And from a policy perspective, if safety really has a big advantage. So no one argues about safety. If we can't get policies implemented about safety, we're going to have trouble getting them implemented about other things. Traffic operations, asset management, fuel efficiency, emissions reduction, eco-driving, VMT reduction, ITS deployment, intelligent transportation systems, the funding issues, and now performance management, because the idea that's coming into the reauthorisation bills is if we're spending all this money, we need to be able to measure what we're getting for our money. So that's going to be a big theme. and maybe pricing, so you actually pay for what you use. But on the second word there, the transportation, and as I've tried to portray to you, transportation is kind of an expanding concept. It's not automotive, not just automotive, but what is it? And what's going to change it? It's certainly going to be diverse in energy. It's going to have electrified vehicles, it's going to have advanced biofuels and so on. And there are many issues there about supply chains for those kinds of, and business models for those kinds of forms of energy on a large scale. It's going to be multimodal, it's going to be connected and seamless, and we've just had a great session on that subject. It's going to be very service oriented. It needs to be modular and adaptable, and maybe eventually there's going to be some autonomy finding its way into the system. So these are things that are going to change, and hopefully by design. And I think David might have talked about designing something. We don't often talk about that in the transportation system. We design vehicles, but we don't design the system. So a lot of things to be done there. I'm sure Rob's going to talk about the livability principles, but which have been enunciated by Ray LaHood, the Transportation Secretary. And really, the first one there, of course, provide more transportation choices, and that says a lot in itself, and really kind of expands what we mean by transportation, what we're trying to do. We went down to Washington last year, almost a year ago actually, to kind of take the temperature in several departments about sustainable transportation. And what we learned was that really the definition of transportation is kind of merging into housing and urban form, that one day perhaps the state DOTs won't be DOTs anymore, but they'll be looking after all infrastructure, including housing and so on. And the notion that transportation in the past has really been a driver in urban form, whether we like it or not. So bringing that better together under this umbrella of livability, and of course livability is really a proxy for doing something about climate change and oil dependence, but it was considered to be probably much more saleable out there in the community. Sue and others have already, Richard and so on, have all been talking about hub networks, and it always fascinates me that when Sue did the mapping in Washington DC, so these little red nodes are where there are 3 or 4 transportation modes in close proximity. So this is the underlying system that we didn't know we had. Modularity, my background is in the freight side, and this is the European concept for modular use of standard units, whether standard sized trailers, and you can connect them together in any combination you want and get a lot more productivity. One point that's clear, we a couple of years ago we had the Swiss ambassador to the US came to talk about transportation here at the university, and there are 2 things I wanted to point out on this slide. One is that the large proportion of trips that are done by rail in Switzerland, and the reason for that, or a huge reason for that, is the fact that they've had such long-term stable funding, decades-long funding cycles for building the rail system all over the country. The second interesting thing to me about this is that still the majority of trips in Switzerland are done by car, so I think that tells us something about the future. So the national policy segments that we currently know about are somewhat divided up and fragmented to some extent, I think. Vehicle fuel economy and the use of alternative fuels, vehicle emissions, both criterion emissions and carbon emissions, vehicle safety standards, infrastructure safety standards, and of course the traffic code for operations and various aspects of driver behaviour out on the highway. So all of these have their own policy streams associated with them currently. And maybe the research, hopefully the research is underpinning these national policies, and I guess there's some kind of alignment there. Certainly with ground vehicles, we're seeing research being done by DOE, Department of Defence, the DOT of course, and the EPA. Many issues being looked at: fuel efficiency, electrification, lightweighting, occupant protection, crash avoidance, driver information, heavy truck safety, autonomous and remote control are all being researched pretty heavily at the federal level by some of these departments. There's not currently a lot of crossover between those, but overall it's more than $500 million program across all those departments, where we should be getting maybe a bit more value. The drivers, and particularly behavioural countermeasures, a lot of research on that, research on operations, traffic operations, asset management, and of course intelligent transportation systems, which so far have received very little deployment across the whole network in this country, and we want to see a lot more of that. So really that, I'm just trying to set the scene, explain a little bit about the way we see transportation and how it's a broadening definition.
So, question, Peter?
So certainly.